So we've all been told, ever since we're young, for as long as we can remember, we need to consume more calcium. Our bones depend on it. We're told that our bones really depend on this extra calcium. And why not? Our bones are made of calcium, and when we get older, our bones start to lose calcium. So that's when we need even more calcium to try to at least partially compensate for that calcium that's coming off of our bones. And when we're younger, we're told that we're supposed to consume even more calcium then too, for the exact opposite reason. That's when our bones are most proficient at packing on the calcium, so let's pack it on while we can. Well, it hasn't always been that way. In the 1940s, studies showed that low calcium intake really had nothing at all to do with bone health. In 1962, a joint committee of the World Health Organization and the Food Agriculture Organization concluded that the most apparently healthy people throughout the world are developing and living satisfactorily on a dietary intake of calcium which lies between 300 and over 1,000 milligrams per day. And in 1974, that committee recommended 400 to 500 milligrams per day. Then something happened in the late 70s. Some researchers did a series of calcium balance studies. By calcium balance, they're basically just adding up all the calcium that the subjects consume, add up all the calcium that the subjects excrete, and the difference is the calcium balance. And presumably a higher calcium balance would mean that all that extra calcium balance is going into the bones and making our bones healthier. A negative balance would mean that we're losing calcium and our bones are getting weaker. That's the assumption. And they found that the more calcium the people were consuming, the higher the calcium balance would be. And they found there's a break-even point of how much calcium it takes to have a zero balance. And let's just consume at least that much, maybe more than that, to have a positive calcium balance. And then we're okay, right? That's the assumption. And they found that in women, that break-even point is at 990 milligrams of calcium per day for premenopausal women, 1,241 milligrams per day for perimenopausal women, and 1,504 milligrams on average for postmenopausal women. So even postmenopausal women could be continuing to get stronger and stronger bones if they just consume over 1,500 milligrams of calcium per day. So then, of course, all the recommendations, they started going up. In 1997, USA and Canada both increased the recommendation to 1,200 milligrams per day for adults over 50 years old. And in 2002, a committee of the World Health Organization and the Food Agriculture Organization increased their recommendation to 1,300 milligrams for postmenopausal women and for men over 60. And in 2016, the FDA increased the daily value to 1,300 milligrams for calcium, all based on those calcium balance studies. But those calcium balance studies are flawed. They're seriously flawed. For one thing, when they were done in the late 70s, technologies for adding up this calcium, for finding this calcium, weren't very good. And more current studies on calcium balance show different levels. 2007, American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that the zero balance is at only 741 milligrams per day. And they said that also if the subjects consumed a little bit more or a little bit less, it really didn't affect that calcium balance at all. But also, more importantly, those calcium balance studies are all based on the premise that all that extra calcium of a positive calcium balance study is going into the bone. And that's just not true. A lot of it goes into our blood vessels, accumulating on the walls of the blood vessels, causing plaque, atherosclerosis. A lot of it goes into our soft tissue, into our joints, into the disc between our vertebrae, calcifying and hardening the tissue that's supposed to be soft. In the late 80s, we came up with technologies such as photon absorptiometry that was able to look at the actual bone. Instead of looking at the calcium going in and the calcium going out and making assumptions of what happens in between, we're able to look at the bone now. And looking at the bone, we find very different implications than what the calcium balance studies were suggesting. British Medical Journal 1988, the study was published in there that looked at 59 healthy postmenopausal women, and they found that calcium intake had no effect at all on the trabecular bone mineral density. That word trabecular is very important too. I'll talk about that later. And they say that suggestions that a high intake is either effective in preventing postmenopausal osteoporosis or an important adjunct to hormone replacement treatment seem to be without foundation. And to really illustrate how misleading those calcium balance studies are, those same scientists cited an example. There was a study in 1985 where the subjects were given calcium supplements in the form of milk supplements, and that increased the calcium balance of these subjects, but there was no effect at all on bone loss. And they said this emphasizes the limitations of calcium balance studies and the necessity for direct skeletal measurements. Fast forward 3 decades, Journal of Internal Medicine, 2015. these scientists say, introduction of bone densitometry in the 1980s finds there is little evidence of a relationship between bone density and calcium intake. And they cite an example where subjects were consuming 1,500 milligrams per day, they had a positive calcium balance, but the bone mineral density was still decreasing. So we really have to look at bone mineral density. The scientists of that study in 2015, they quote, "The current recommendations for intakes of 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams per day are not firmly based on evidence. Intakes in women consuming only half these quantities are satisfactory." And they recommend 500 to 1,000 milligrams in older individuals that are at risk of osteoporosis. And that's because they're looking at the bone density instead of just the calcium balance. Specifically, trabecular bone density. We really have to look at trabecular bone density. The trabecular bone is the inner portion of the bone. It's a spongy part of the bone, and that's where most bone turnover takes place. And it's wrapped in the cortical bone, which is a very hard, dense bone. And being so hard and dense, the cortical bone actually makes up 80% of the mass of the skeleton. But the trabecular bone is where bone turnover takes place, and osteoporosis is actually due to demineralization of the trabecular bone, not the cortical bone. So we really should look at trabecular bone. And remember, if we're looking at overall bone density, we're mostly looking at cortical bone because that makes up 80% of the skeleton. So we don't want to look at that. We want to focus on trabecular bone density or look at what's called the trabecular score. The trabecular score is done by taking a ratio of the trabecular tissue, which is called the trabeculi, taking a ratio of that tissue to the space between the tissue. And from there they come up with a number. So you could see that healthy bone is going to have a much higher trabecular score than unhealthy bone. And when we look at the trabecular score and the trabecular bone density, we find very, very different results than looking at the calcium balance. 1987, Journal of Clinical Investigations. They looked at 106 women, ages between 23 and 84, 61 of which were postmenopause. And they came up with the conclusion that their data do not support the hypothesis that insufficient dietary calcium is a major cause of bone loss in women. British Journal of Nutrition, 2017. It's a 2-year cohort study on men, 323 men, average age was 57. Their conclusion, bone mineral density and rates of bone loss were unrelated to calcium intake in these men. This suggests that strategies to increase calcium intake are unlikely to impact on the prevalence of and the morbidity from male osteoporosis. And then looking at children and adolescents, here's an article, a study that was published in Pediatrics 2005. And this is a review article. They looked at 58 different studies, any study they could find that looked at the association between calcium and bone health in children and adolescents, or dairy and bone health. And they found neither increased consumption of dairy products specifically nor total dietary calcium consumption has shown even a modestly consistent benefit for child or young adult bone health. And of course the population most at risk of osteoporosis, postmenopausal women. Journal of Reproductive Medicine, 1990. They say controlled studies showed no significant effect of calcium intake on mineral density of trabecular bone and a slight effect on cortical bone. But since primary postmenopausal osteoporosis is predominantly due to demineralization of trabecular bone, there is no justification for calcium megadosing in postmenopausal women. And there's even risks of taking too much calcium. We already alluded to the atherosclerosis from the calcium building up as plaque in our blood vessels. Also prostate cancer, especially if magnesium intake isn't also high, because the calcium to magnesium ratio is very important. It shouldn't be too high. Also, calcium inhibits the utilization and assimilation of other nutrients. One of those nutrients is magnesium, and magnesium is very important for our bones. In fact, magnesium helps the calcium get from our blood into our bone. So if we're consuming too much calcium, the calcium inhibits the magnesium from getting that calcium into the bone. As far as our bone is concerned, too much calcium is really the same as not having enough calcium. Also, there are some scientists that actually theorize that too much calcium when we're young burns out our osteoblasts, because it's like sprinting at the beginning of a marathon. The osteoblasts are the sites on our bone that pull calcium out of our blood and put it into our bone. So too much calcium, it looks great at the beginning because it's all this calcium is going onto our bones and making our bones bigger and stronger. But then over time, the osteoblasts burn out and they can't put calcium into our bone anymore. So we get older and our bone just kind of deteriorates. That's a theory. And our mesenchymal cells do morph into osteoblasts. But who knows, maybe that whole mechanism of the mesenchymal cells morphing into osteoblasts also burns out. That's the theory. Now, if we're talking about calcium supplements, we have an additional list of risks and adverse effects. We've got gastrointestinal effects, and we're not just talking about farting in embarrassing moments. This is, includes trips to the hospital. Kidney stones, heart attacks, strokes. This is all from too much calcium. In fact, it was published in Nutrients 2013. These scientists say, published reports that high calcium intakes in free-living adults have relatively little or no beneficial impact on bone mineral density and fracture rates suggest that current recommendations of calcium for adults may be set too high. They go on to say the likelihood of soft tissue calcification may increase in older adults who take calcium supplements. And they say eliminating potential risks of cardiovascular disease from excessive calcium intakes needs to be factored into policy recommendations for calcium by adults. So why are we still being told to consume so much calcium? Here's a study from Cardiovascular Diabetology in 2014. They looked at the association between diabetes and bone health. And they found that the healthiest range of calcium intake is between 400 and 600 milligrams per day. And they also recommend that the magnesium should be high. There's that ratio again. And they say that the ratio of calcium to magnesium should be 2 to 2.5. No more than 2 to 2.5. In other words, twice as much calcium, maybe 2.5 times as much calcium as magnesium. Now, let's look at the daily values in this country. And by the way, this study was done in Taiwan. And in Taiwan, the daily value is actually 600 milligrams there. That's what they recommend, not 1,300 like what's recommended here. Now here, until 2016, the recommendation was 1,000 milligrams of calcium. And the magnesium was 400 milligrams. That's a ratio of 2.5. Technically, it's in that range that the scientists suggest, but it's literally at the high point of that range. Then in 2016, the FDA goes and increases the daily value of calcium 30%. To 1,300 milligrams. They also increased the magnesium daily value, but only 5%. So now the ratio is 3.1 instead of 2 to 2.5. So why are we being told to consume so much calcium? Well, let's face it. If we're told to consume a lot of calcium, what the implication there is that we should consume loads of dairy. Even though you eat your vegetables and grains and beans, and anything we eat is going to have some calcium, especially vegetables are loaded with calcium. We get plenty of calcium without dairy. But we're told that we need to consume huge amounts of calcium, and the only way to get that calcium is to consume dairy products. And the dairy industry spends millions of dollars lobbying the policymakers to put out these recommendations, to put these dairy into the school lunch program and to teach the kids that dairy builds strong bones and that we need loads of calcium. This is all the dairy industry talking. Millions of dollars they're lobbying for this. And you would think the policymakers would say, okay, well, I hear what you're saying, but let me check the science before we actually go through with this. And they'll look at the science and say, wait a minute, the actual science says exactly the opposite of what you're telling me. The science says that we don't need that much calcium. In fact, too much calcium is actually bad for us. Why aren't the policymakers saying that? Because they're in office because of the dairy industry. The dairy industry spends millions of dollars on their campaigns. 2015 to 2016 election, they spent almost $1.6 million on Republicans running for House of Representatives and about $400,000 on Democrats running for House. That's almost $2 million right there for House. And then for Senate, they put in about almost $800,000 toward campaigns for running for U.S. Senate. These policymakers are in office because of the dairy industry. And they know in a couple of years they're going to have to run again. And they're going to need that money all over again. Of course they're going to do what the dairy industry tells them to do. And of course they're going to say what the dairy industry tells them to say. They even made it so that our tax money pays the dairy industry for producing dairy that's going to get thrown away. And it's all under the premise that calcium is so important to our health and dairy is so important to getting all this extra calcium that we can't take a chance at being cut short on calcium. And the only way to not be cut short on calcium is to not be cut short on dairy. And the only way to make sure we're not cut short on dairy is to produce extra dairy. And who's going to pay for all that extra dairy that gets thrown away? Well, the taxpayers. But do we have to believe that? Are we going to believe the dairy industry who's lining their pockets by telling us to consume loads and loads of dairy and calcium? Or are we going to believe the scientists that are saying, no, moderate amounts of calcium is good. Too much calcium is bad. And the scientists are telling us other ways to improve our bone health. And that's what we'll talk about in the next video. That's all we have for you today. Thank you for watching. Be sure to hit subscribe and hit the notification bell. I'm Ken Vasity. We'll see you next time. Thank you.